From a very young age, children are capable of showing a remarkable sensitivity to injustice. The words, "no fair," come early to a child's lips, as any parent in this room can attest, and they do so with little or no prompting from his mother and father, unlike "please" and "thank you," the reliable deployment of which often requires incessant reminders over the course of many years. Indeed, you could probably teach a parakeet to say "please" more quickly than some children, but so the ability to identify inequitable treatment for what it is requires another kind of intelligence altogether. To announce, if only by tears, that such and such was unfair is one of the first signs of the child's possession of reason, by which classical authors meant the power to form an independent judgment about the world around us. Which brings me to my second point. Every bit as impressive as the child's capacity to recognize a wrong is his inability to suffer it. Or to state the thought in more positive terms, children have a very strong desire to see that wrongs be righted. You won't find a pair of bloodhounds pausing to eye each other's bowls before plunging into their respective allotments of dog chow. But a 3-year-old child cannot help but notice that the slice of cake on her plate is smaller than the slice before her brother. And even if the difference between the two servings is almost negligible, her distress at the inequity and her attendant hunger for justice will almost certainly prevail over her desire to eat what cake she has, her pleasure in cake notwithstanding. Bertolt Brecht, shameless apologist for Stalin that he was, famously observed that erst kommt das Fressen, dann kommt die Morale, or loosely put, grub before duty. Brecht's position is the cynical one that a concern for justice is a luxury to be enjoyed only after one has stuffed his face. Preschool children routinely demonstrate the falseness of Brecht's outlook. This is not to say that a child's sense of justice is always adequate to the occasion, nor that its dedication to its cause is reliably wholehearted. Children are commonly much more alert to and indignant about wrongs done to them than they are about those they have inflicted on their siblings. And even when they do regret the wrongs they do, and lament wrongs suffered by others in which they have no part, the scope of a child's moral qualms is ordinarily limited to a rather narrow range of harms done, affecting the small circle of his family and his friends. The very young naturally have an interest in justice, but what they actually understand about its terms is necessarily rudimentary and partial. The classical definition of justice is easily stated: to render to each his due. It's much more difficult to know with the requisite precision just what is owed and by whom in all of the particular situations in which just agency is called for. One might conclude with the book of Proverbs that adults owe it in justice to children to raise them up in the way they should go. True though that precept surely is, however, it is not the point of this event. I shall explain why momentarily. The occasion for our gathering is the publication in English of a book entitled Elementary Experience and Law. The book is the collaborative effort of 4 professors of law, 3 Italian and 1 American. The operative term of their collaboration, elementary experience, was coined by Msgr Giussani in a book of his entitled The Religious Sense, to name the source of, among other things, the human phenomenon I have been describing. Everyone is aware that children are naturally concerned about justice. The coinage, elementary experience, was necessary, he thought, because he wished to call to our attention something of great, indeed infinite significance about this childish phenomenon and other common human phenomena that we commonly overlook. What Giussani means by original or elementary experience, then, is, quote, a complex of evidences, needs and evidences, which accompany us as we come face to face with all that exists. By virtue of this complex, he continues, nature thrusts man into a universal comparison with himself, with others, with things. These original needs and evidences are, he says, the tools with which we are naturally equipped in order to engage in that lifelong comparison. It follows that everything man does or says depends on them. I shall now attempt very briefly to unpack these large claims, beginning with the needs he has in mind, which are themselves original or elementary in at least two respects. They are, in the first place, constitutive of our very humanity, so basic that although they can be given many names and can be summarized with different expressions, they are what we have in common with every other human being and what distinguishes us from countless other forms of life on Earth. Emblematic examples for Giussani are the need for happiness, for truth, and for justice. A second sense in which these needs are original has to do with the way they function, which is, he says, like a spark igniting the human motor, such that prior to them there is no properly human movement or dynamism. Giussani's claim is, willy-nilly, that whatever we might say or do depends in some way upon them. It's perhaps somewhat harder to grasp what original evidence means, but we need only reflect upon the word need to grasp what Giussani has in mind. Consider a young child who, in the face of some glaring iniquity, desires justice. Given his inexperience of the ways of the world, this desire could only have emerged in him because ingredient to his awareness of himself and of the world is some sense, however vague and even confused, of what justice involves, as also the fundamental conviction, for want of a better word, that this justice is what he is made for, what he really needs. Elementary evidence, then, identifies the fact that human beings somehow possess by nature the basic vocabulary and syntax of love, of truth, of justice, and other essential human needs. Because we can only seek what in some measure we already knowingly possess, this evidence must somehow be inscribed in the human heart from birth. There is admittedly something mysterious about such evidence, and Giussani makes no attempt to explain away its paradoxical character. But of course, it's the mark of a fool to deny what must be the case just because he cannot fully comprehend it. Finally, a word about experience. According to the common way of thinking, pretty much anything that happens to us, good or bad, counts as experience, provided that it has sufficient force to make an impression or to solicit some emotion. This is not Giussani's position. In his view, there is experience in the strict sense only when something or other that provokes us, that we undergo, is subjected to our judgment. Original experience, accordingly, involves just the comparison I have already mentioned between whatever we might happen to encounter in the circumstances of our lives and the elementary needs and evidences that make us human. These latter provide the criteria, to invoke another word Giussani commonly uses in this context, for the comparisons or judgments we make. And in the moment we form them, the criteria themselves, which he also calls the ultimate demands of the human heart, begin to emerge in the experience as themselves experienced. So here, original experience. I hasten to add that the questioning engagement with the world that Father Giussani seeks to describe is not an act of reflection or abstract speculation, although original experience certainly is at work also in genuinely theoretical or contemplative activity. The judging in question need not even find expression expressly in words. To return to our point of departure, the child who bursts into tears on suddenly discovering that his playmate won some game because he was cheating has surely begun to experience in Giussani's sense. His situation is plainly not the equal of parents who mourn the death of a child senselessly murdered, or of an innocent wrongly accused of a capital offense, or of a father betraying those who he loves, who laments the harm he has done them. The immediate stakes in the child's case may be small, tiny in comparison with the others. But what arises in his heart is at bottom essentially the same yearning for justice, the same question in truth. I must make one last observation about elementary experience in order to set the stage for the discussion of the issues raised by the book before us by our two panelists. Someone reading Giussani's account of elementary experience might object that if he's right, and if every human heart is naturally constituted by the same original needs and evidences, why should Giussani bother to speak so often and at such length about them? The objection would be devastating were Giussani to have thought he was telling us something new, something we didn't know already. In fact, his aim is not to prove to his readers that their hearts are as he describes them, which would be a monumentally foolish undertaking. His aim is rather to remind us that our hearts are so. And a reminder is necessary, he thinks, because we labor very hard to forget who we are and what we really want. In our personal lives and through the legacy of our moral, cultural, and political engagements with our fellow human beings, we human beings seek to reduce the object of our heart's yearnings. We attempt to put a damper on them, to manage them, to control them, which brings me to elementary experience and law. On the face of it, one might think that the law, or what we call the legal system, is ordained precisely to serve the cause of justice. After all, it is the Chief Justice of the United States who sits at the apex of the legal order in this country. And the poor stiff at its base, charged with superintendence of the most humble statutes of the land, the misdemeanors, is still invested with the august title of Justice of the Peace. In both theory and practice, however, the way we actually think about the law is very different. In practice, nothing could be more revealing than the disdain in which a once admired profession, the legal profession, is so widely held nowadays. Why did God make lawyers? One of a legion of jokes about lawyers asks, to which the correct answer is, so that real estate agents would have someone to look down upon. To be fair, that's only one of 3 genuine lawyer jokes in existence. All the rest are true stories. In theory, the picture is even worse. According to common opinion and numerous legal theorists, the laws really have nothing to do with the human hunger for justice. They are rather as the good fences that make for what we suppose to be good neighbors. Set down and enforced by the state, they are obeyed by all reasonable people who imagine that in their absence, all chaos would break loose. In compensation, laws so conceived leave us alone to do whatever we want, or rather they serve to allow us to serve whatever set of individual urges and compulsions, the exercise of which we fancy to be our rights. The laws so conceived allow us to enslave ourselves. Looking at the great many differences, small and large, between the rules in force in one society and those in another, and apprehensive about the consequences of allowing anyone to question publicly the meaning of what the state determines to be just, some legal theorists even go so far as to argue, consistently with the position just sketched, that the legal system is alone competent to render justice. During the season of Advent, the liturgy of the Church accords prominent place to a verse from the prophet of Isaiah. It makes this verse its own in a particular way. Rorate celi de super et nubes pluant justum. Drop down dew, ye heavens, from above, and let the clouds rain the just one. One could describe the singular merit of the four authors of Elementary Experience and Law, Andrea Simoncini, Lorenza Violini, Paolo Carrozza, and Marta Cartabia, to have made the human yearning for justice embodied in that verse the pole star of their reflections on the law. To discuss the book and to provide some reflections of their own on its themes, we have invited two friends to join us today. Michael Hanby is Associate Professor at the John Paul II Institute for Studies of Marriage and Family at the Catholic University of America. After earning a BS degree from the University of Colorado, he went on to receive an MDiv from Duke and his PhD from the University of Virginia. The current focus of his teaching involves a theological consideration of science, medicine, and biotechnology. Before joining the faculty of the Institute, he taught at Baylor University and Villanova. He is the author of No God, No Science, Theology, Cosmology, and Biology, to be published this coming April, and Augustine and Modernity, published in 2003. Professor Hanby and his wife Stephanie have two young children and live in University Park, Maryland. Professor Elizabeth Schlitz is Professor of Law at the University of St. Thomas School of Law in Minneapolis. After receiving a BA in philosophy from Yale and a JD from Columbia, she practiced for many years as a banking regulatory lawyer. She began her academic career at Notre Dame, which she left in 2000 to become one of the founding members of the St. Thomas School of Law. There she teaches contracts, sales, consumer law, and feminist jurisprudence. Professor Schlitz also publishes and speaks on the topic of Catholic feminism and on issues related to the sanctity of life. She lives in Minneapolis with her husband, federal Judge Patrick J. Schlitz, and their 4 children. We shall first hear from Professor Schlitz, who will speak for 20 minutes, and then from Professor Hanby, who will also have 20 minutes. Equality before the law. Our meeting will conclude, I'm the law here, if time permits, with perhaps 10 minutes for questions.
Thank you. As the only lawyer on the panel, I should be offended by those lawyer jokes that I just heard, but I'm going to brush right by that. And what I'm going to offer you instead today is, I think, an example of the elementary experience at work in 2 related areas of law, feminist jurisprudence and disability rights theory. Some feminist legal scholars and disability rights scholars are, I believe, using right now insights from their own shared elementary experiences to critique some modern ideas about freedom and autonomy that have shaped much of the recent law in both of these areas. Father Giussani identifies a number of fundamental needs as part of the complex of the elementary experience: truth, justice, happiness, and one that Father Caron emphasized in his wonderful remarks a few hours ago, love. My focus is on love. In particular, love as both experienced and manifested in the act of caring for another and taking care of another. Both the feeling of love, of caring for, and the act and the work, doing the work of caring for another. It is the elementary experience of the impulse to care for the most vulnerable among us that is my focus today. Andrea Simoncini, in his contribution to the book that we're discussing, suggests that the following is what elementary experience can do for us as scholars of law. Quote, "The notion of elementary experience provides not a theory to be executed and applied, but rather a fitting explanation for understanding behavior of human beings that would otherwise be indecipherable. What elementary experience makes possible is a comparison of itself with all the different judgments and proposals of morality, allowing us to adhere to those which correspond to it." Perhaps some of you saw recently an article by James Gorman in the New York Times. It was published in the middle of December, and it was reprinted in my local Minneapolis paper, so some of you might have seen it, even if you're not from New York. It was about archaeologists who were studying the bones of prehistoric humans to learn about what they call the bioarchaeology of care. The picture that accompanied the article showed the skeleton of a young man who had lived 4,000 years ago in what is now northern Vietnam. All the other skeletons buried there lie straight, but he was found curled in a fetal position. All his vertebrae were fused together due to a congenital disease. He would not have had much use of his arms, could not have fed himself or kept himself clean. Yet he lived for 10 years or so in a community of people who lived by fishing and hunting, yet took the time and the care to tend to his every need. Other examples in that article were even older, a Neanderthal man from Iraq, dating 45,000 years ago, who lived to around 50 years of age with one arm amputated and the loss of vision in one eye, and a boy from 7,500 years ago found in Florida who lived to the age of 15 with spina bifida. The physical evidence that's the focus of these archaeologists cannot tell us much about cognitive disabilities. How many people with Down syndrome or mental retardation have been similarly cared for throughout the ages? It's people with cognitive disabilities that I think are particularly vulnerable today, and the impulse to care for those people is the focus of my remarks. If I'm right about what I am seeing that I will describe to you, the idea is that perhaps what Andrea Simoncini suggests is correct, right? This might be an opening of some space for the church to engage in dialogue with secular society to seek consensus about ethical principles of law in some very contentious areas, such as eugenic abortion and the appropriate ethics of compassionate care for people with disabilities. Our current American disability laws are absolutely schizophrenic and perhaps totally incomprehensible. On the one hand, in our laws, we see things like the recent Health and Human Services regulations implementing the Affordable Care Act that include prenatal testing for genetic or developmental conditions as a preventative health service to be provided for free to all pregnant women. Since the only thing that can be done at this time to prevent, for example, Down syndrome, one of the most easily identified prenatal conditions, is to prevent the child with Down syndrome from being born, the effect of this legal development seems pretty clear: the eradication of people with such disabilities. At the same time, though, we do continue to pass all sorts of laws that express a strong commitment to bettering the lives of our fellow citizens with disabilities. We have the Americans with Disabilities Act, which prohibits discrimination against people with disabilities. The IDEA, which ensures the education of children with disabilities in our public schools. And even more recently, Congress passed with overwhelming bipartisan support the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, prohibiting employers or health insurers from discriminating in any way based on information from genetic tests. These two trends in our laws present a very puzzling contradiction. The theologian Stanley Hauerwas offers what I think is the most cogent diagnosis and description of this contradiction. Hauerwas spent most of his life working with and writing about people with disabilities, and after decades of such work, he came to realize that people with cognitive disabilities were, quote, "the crack I desperately needed to give concreteness to my critique of modernity. No group exposes the pretensions of the humanism that shapes the practices of modernity more thoroughly than the mentally handicapped. Our humanism entails we care for them once they are among us, once we are stuck with them, but the same humanism cannot help but think that, all things considered, it would be better if they did not exist." I think that's a brilliant description of the contradictions that shape our laws. All things considered, it would be better if the disabled, especially the severely cognitively disabled, did not exist, so we should eliminate them if at all possible. But once we're stuck with them, we ought to take care of them and treat them fairly. The critique of modern humanism that Hauerwas then develops out of this insight focuses on two basic premises of modern secular ideas about what it means to be human, both of which are fundamentally related to modern ideas of freedom, the theme of this conference. One premise is that we humans are fundamentally characterized by our autonomy. The second is that we humans are fundamentally characterized by our own capacity for self-definition. Though we may not think of it too often, and we may not even be aware of it, those two ideas really form the basis of how we organize ourselves as a society, how we think about justice, how we structure our legal systems. We typically assume that we should structure our society and our laws around the model human being, one who is autonomous and able to define himself, because that model is what most of us are like, or at least the ones of us that really matter most. Other humans who don't fit that model are the exceptions, and if we can squeeze them into our society and our laws as exceptions, we do, when and if it works, if it's convenient, and if the budget allows. But now let's look at how Hauerwas, as well as a number of feminist and disability rights scholars, are beginning to question those two premises, and how those questions are often being driven, I think, by appeals to the elementary experience of caring. I only have 20 minutes, so I'm just going to take a passing swipe at the truly fascinating story of how a group of feminists known as care feminists or dependency feminists launched what has become a fairly widespread challenge of the first presumption, that humans are essentially and fundamentally characterized by our autonomy. These feminists started a bunch of people questioning theories of justice and legal schemes that are structured around the traditional liberal paradigm of the autonomous person. What they point out is that this model is just not true about all humans, and in any event, it's not what is even more true about all humans. In reality, if you look at the real experience of life, what is more true about all of us is that every human being actually is totally dependent on others at the beginning of life, as well as sometimes at the end of and throughout life. If you're interested in the development of this theory, I could refer you to some articles I've written where I go into great detail and reflect on the relationship between these critiques and Catholic social teachings. But for our purposes today, I just want to emphasize what it was that drove this ambitious and still very controversial agenda of replacing traditional liberal, equality-based theories that underpin much of modern feminism with a dependency-based model of feminism that permits accommodations for those needing or engaging in care work. What inspired it was the observation that women do not want to give up this care work, or should not have to, or maybe just realistically will never be able to. In so much of this scholarship, you find appeals to the experience of caring, the universal reaction of needing and wanting to care for those who are dependent on us, the universal elementary experience of caring. So let me move to the second aspect of modern humanism, our emphasis on our capacity for self-definition. Hauerwas argues that the disabled confront us directly with the fact that we humans do not, in fact, create and define ourselves from limitless blank slates of possibility, but that we are, rather, creatures of God. Hauerwas points out that parents of kids with disabilities are confronted with this very directly. It was so easy for me to consider my first two kids as creatures of my making, a perfect girl, a perfect boy, prodigies out of the womb. They were people that my husband and I created. They were mini-me's. They were exactly what we had in mind when we thought about creating our family. It was harder to have that same attitude about my third child born with Down syndrome, though, of course, we would not trade him for the world. Before I met him, he was not the baby I would have chosen out of the catalog. He's not what I would have created if I had the power to put together the DNA and bones and body parts and skin to create a baby. The disability of a child forces parents to truly appreciate that our children are gifted to us by God. We don't get to choose our gifts, and we don't have the total freedom to create our children's identities, or by extension, our own identities. Of course, all parents are eventually forced to recognize that this is true of all their kids, and that helps us all to understand that it's true of all of us. Our capacity for self-definition is not absolute. We come into this world as creations of God. Related to this is a conundrum that's faced by all who care for people with disabilities. The whole ideology of the contemporary disability rights movement is based on a social construction model of disability. This model views a disability as more a function of the physical and social standards established by our society as normal than as a function of some defect in the body of the individual with a disability. It's the society that constructs buildings with stairs rather than elevators or ramps that disables the person who uses the wheelchair rather than the paralysis of her legs. This model enabled the emergence of the disability rights movement in the late 60s, and borrowing language and tactics from the civil rights movement, it led to the enactment of wonderful laws like the Americans with Disabilities Act. But This social construction model of disability is based on a concept of human nature in which self-representation and the freedom of the self to shape its own identity are paramount. It can put advocates of the intellectually disabled, who naturally want to follow the best practices of the disability rights movement, in a quandary. Parents are confronted with both this ideal of autonomy and self-determination and the reality of a totally dependent child. Simoncini, in this book, also critiques this notion of self-definition in a very different context, criticizing, quote, the sanctification of the principle of self-determination even at the cost of going against real-world evidence. In discussing the Englaro case about the withdrawal of treatment in Italy from a patient in a permanent vegetative state, Simoncini makes the point that the principle of self-determination was applied to a person who cannot, quote, for objective reasons make autonomous self-determinations, through the application of the abnormal legal fiction in which the decision of one person in the place of another's becomes self-determination. What I want to share with you now is what I think is a particularly dramatic illustration of how the elementary experience of coming face to face with all that exists, in this case, the reality of the love one father feels for his disabled child, opened a space for dialogue and understanding between a person of faith, Hauerwas, and a secular disability rights scholar on this very question, that abnormal legal fiction of that principle of self-determination. I want to describe one particular encounter, a striking dialogue between Hauerwas and Michael Berube. It's from a 2004 collection of essays edited by John Swinton called Critical Reflections on Stanley Hauerwas's Theology of Disability. Berube is an eloquent and insightful professor of English at Penn State, and he's a secular modern humanist who in 1996 wrote a wonderful book called Life as We Know It, about his experiences as the father of a son with Down syndrome, Jamie. In that book, Berube writes, quote, I have no sweeter dream than to imagine, aesthetically and ethically and parentally, that Jamie will someday be his own advocate, his own author, his own best representative. Hauerwas comments, quote, how sad. All Berube can imagine for Jamie is that he be his own author. That Berube can imagine no other future is not his fault. His imagination reflects the same limits that form the conceptions of justice he found so unsatisfactory. What other possibility can there be in a world in which God does not exist? Berube responds by arguing that Hauerwas has misunderstood him. He was not incorporating any sort of existential, robust capacity for self-definition into his dreams for Jamie, but rather a more modest hope that Jamie would someday be able to make his own contributions to advocating for himself. In other words, participate himself in the vision offered by the social construct theory of disability. Berube acknowledges that he is, quote, caught in a terrible paradox, affirming autonomy and dependency at once for different reasons. Both Hauerwas and Berube acknowledge that this paradox stems from tension caused by the modern emphasis on self-definition, captured by Kant's second formulation of the categorical imperative, never to treat another human as a means only. The parents of an intellectually disabled child do have to act on behalf of her child in many ways, without any regard to the will of a child who cannot express herself. Does that mean that this parent is using her child as a means? Hauerwas suggests that Berube and others like him should just reject Kant's second formulation as a flawed consequence of our modern obsession with self-definition. Quote, of course we use the handicapped. We are here to be of use to one another. The notion that any use we make of another can only be justified if it is done voluntarily can now be seen as one of the peculiar sentimentalities of modernity. That the handicapped are subject for care for their own good, a good they may not have chosen, is not an indication that such care is misguided, but rather requires that the good that such care be serving is properly named. After all, they, like us who are not retarded, exist to serve and be served for our mutual upbringing. As Christians, we should not feel embarrassed to discover that the mentally handicapped among us help us to better understand the narrative that constitutes the very purpose of our existence. Berube acknowledges that after first resisting Hauerwas's critique, on further reflection, his experience with Jamie has caused him to, quote, realize now that my aversion to the human uses of human beings was perhaps too fastidious. Professor Hauerwas is right. In the course of our lives, we cannot not make use of others. And how awful would it be, in ethical theory or in family gatherings, if we did not set out to make ourselves useful to others? This admission that we cannot not make use of others is an acknowledgement that no one can be absolutely and entirely the author of her own existence, right? And Bérubé reaches this conclusion through what I think can be understood as an appeal to our elementary experience, reflecting on how awful it would be in real-life family gatherings if we did not set out to make ourselves useful to others. In another book, Hauerwas makes the point that people like Bérubé, who try to intellectually reconcile their autonomy-based theories of justice with convictions about the equal worth of people with disabilities who are vivid contradictions of this autonomy, will never be successful. The whole social construct theory, and so much of what we modern humans assume when we think about politics and law, depends on making arguments that appeal to the self-interest of those paradigm, autonomous, self-defining actors. Hauerwas argues it's simply impossible for anyone to demonstrate intellectually that it really is in the self-interest of the non-disabled to care for the disabled. A theoretical argument based on why it should be in one's self-interest to care for the disabled will not convince anyone. Only the experience of such care will convince anyone of its value, and no one will rationally undertake such an obligation out of self-interest. Some other motivation than self-interest has to provide the impetus for the experience that teaches the value of the care of the disabled. For Michael Bérubé, it was the happenstance of giving birth to an intellectually disabled child. Now, Bérubé, in this debate with Hauerwas, keeps trying to make intellectual arguments that defend the basic presumptions of autonomy and self-definition. But Hauerwas concludes that these arguments just cannot be reconciled with his own commitment to take care of his son. The only thing that justifies that commitment is the fact that Bérubé, by virtue of his fatherhood, had the experience of caring for Jamie. Hauerwas writes, there's a little complicated quote because it's quoting Hauerwas, and sometimes he's quoting Bérubé in the book Life as We Know It, but bear with me. It's important. Bérubé either cannot or does not choose to make intelligible his admirable commitment to Jamie. For example, with great candor, Bérubé tells us that he and his wife are as pro-choice after the birth of Jamie as they were prior to his birth. Indeed, he notes they intentionally did not use amniocentesis, assuring they would just love the baby all the more if the baby was born with Down syndrome. He confesses such stance was blithe and uninformed, and that if they had known that their child's life would be suffering and misery for all concerned, they might have chosen to have an abortion. Bérubé notes, however, that it is extremely difficult to discuss Jamie in this way. Just as it was hard to talk about him as a medicalized being when he was in the ICU, it is still harder, quote, to talk about him in terms of our philosophical beliefs about abortion and prenatal testing. That's partly because these issues are so famously divisive and emotionally charged, but it's also because we can no longer frame any such questions about our child now that he's here. Now that he is here is the nub of the matter. Bérubé does not pretend to be able to do much more than represent Jamie now that he is here. And indeed, Bérubé concedes this point in his response to Hauerwas, his final response. Though as a secular humanist, he cannot accept the theological aspects of Hauerwas's critique of modern humanism, he finds the critique convincing. Without the theological basis, though, he cannot explain why it is convincing. He just knows from his experience with Jamie that it is correct. This is what he writes. As non-Christians, we therefore find a place in Hauerwas's model, a place where we too can be of use, precisely to the extent we do not feel compelled to justify the existence of the mentally handicapped. I will try to eschew justification altogether, quoting something Jamie said to me last month as he fell asleep on my arm when we were riding a train to New York. "Daddy," he said, groggily, and with reference to nothing at all, "always be my friend." As I assured him with all my heart that I would always be his friend, I couldn't help wondering, now where in the world did that come from? Thanks to Hauerwas, I now know I need not bother asking. The question, like the fact of our obligations to each other, does not come from anywhere. It is simply here now that Jamie is here. And the only thing that matters is that Christians and non-Christians alike respond to it with all the caritas they can invent or imagine. What is it that is simply here now that Jamie is here? Is it perhaps the elementary experience of loving your own child, of caring, that is somehow magnified when directed toward another being who's uniquely dependent on that care, that love? Might reflection on and attention to that common elementary experience help us to resolve some of those contradictions reflected in our disability laws? Perhaps such motivations, those reflections might motivate us all, Christians and non-Christians alike, to respond to this elemental experience of love with all the caritas we can invent or imagine. And isn't this indeed the hope and perhaps the promise of appeals to our shared elementary experience? Thank you.
Thank you. Is this on? I guess I need to bring this a little closer. Thank you, Lisa. I would like to begin by thanking Riro Maniscalco and Angelo Sala and Olivetta Danesi and Carlo Lancelotti and all the organizers of the New York Encounter for the generous hospitality that they've shown to my family and me, and for inviting me to speak at this wonderful event in an area where I really have no particular expertise. I'm not sure their confidence is warranted. I hope it is. But I'm grateful to them nevertheless for the opportunity to think about new things. I've already learned a lot from the experience, and I'm grateful to Lisa and to the authors in attendance here for patiently indulging the comments of a dilettante in the area of their life's work. I'll try to keep them brief to avoid taxing their patience too long, which means that I've cut out all the jokes, sparing the lawyers who have managed to remain with us this long. I've been asked to offer a few thoughts not only about the book Elementary Experience in Law, but about whether the methodological approach from elementary experience that it proposes can help us understand the problem of how law in our society realizes or suppresses genuine human freedom. And this is kind of a tricky question to me, both because I'm a dilettante in the philosophy of law, but also because it's not clear to me, as an outsider, just to what extent the philosophy of law is really able to affect jurisprudence. And perhaps I can be instructed on this point by the lawyers among us. But it seems to me that it's part of the function of the tradition of legal positivism, which is criticized in this book, to hold this kind of thought at arm's length, to insulate jurisprudence from ultimate questions about the nature and sources of law, and to enforce a merely practical agreement about these questions, which typically masks a substantive anthropology and legal philosophy. This approach as a whole, I think, is valuable simply for bringing this problem to light, though for much more besides. Yet to the degree that this is true, this book and its approach seem to me to make an important contribution both constructively and critically, though I imagine it is also likely to be something of a voice crying in the wilderness. Let me say something about the constructive dimension of this approach first. Treating law from the perspective of elementary experience, it seems to me, is both a particularly compelling way of keeping alive fundamental questions. Where does the law come from? How does it oblige? And of reminding us of what should be obvious but sadly no longer seems to be, namely that the source and purpose of law is justice, the ultimate measure of which is the good of the human person. The test of experience provides a vantage from which the authors launch a number of important criticisms of the prevailing order of things. Andrea Simoncini criticizes the equation of law with state power, a view which must ultimately be indifferent to the question of justice, leaves us unable to say why we obey, and thus fails to be true to the essence of law or true to life. The author's criticisms of the proliferation of rights penetrates what I take to be the central ambiguity at the heart of the liberal conception of freedom or of rights, whether understood negatively as immunities from coercion or positively as entitlements. Law enlarges the scope of liberty, Locke wrote in the second treatise. Apparently he did not stop to consider that liberty likewise enlarges the scope of law, and that the proliferation of rights or liberty atomizes the citizenry and insinuates the state as the mediator of all human relationships. Paradoxically, liberal freedom and the scope and power of the state are proportionally and not inversely related. And in helping us to understand this phenomenon, this approach helps us to understand how it is that liberal democracies can tend toward their totalitarian opposites in the very action of pursuing human rights and human dignity. The authors point a way around these impasses by grounding positive law in something prior to law, the universal longing for justice that makes up one aspect of elementary experience, by suggesting that this experience can at least help to supply a criterion for distinguishing truly universal rights claims from merely particular interests, and by urging that concrete engagement with experience in the lived quest for justice might help us to avoid the scylla of a merely practical agreement over rights, such as has heretofore underwritten the UN Charter on Human Rights, and the charybdis of unresolvable disagreement over the ultimate philosophical and anthropological foundations of law. This alters what I take to be a quintessentially American conception of law, because it presupposes a different, and I would say truer, understanding of the human being than lies at the basis of liberal political order. Law is not simply coercive, a mere external curb on libertarian freedom. Rather, law in its essence, if not in each of its concrete instances, is an expression of the universal human longing for justice, and thus a reason for action, which means that the law is also a pedagogue, a teacher, habituating us in its vision of human nature and destiny. This is all very good, and I think very promising. But I'm still left with some unresolved questions that bear ultimately on this question of the fruitfulness of this approach. There seems to me to be a tension throughout the book between the central concept of elementary experience, understood as a concrete and universal fact of human existence prior to theory and culture, and theory, whether about justice or human nature, which is sometimes treated somewhat dismissively as unhelpful and abstract speculation subject to the particularities and vagaries of history. Now, let me be clear, it's a very subtle tension, to be sure. Andrea Simoncini urges us to discover what is elemental and universal in experience by entering more deeply into its concrete historical particularity, thereby opposing any easy juxtaposition of universality and particularity. And I think this is certainly correct. Paolo Carrozza is critical of the ostensibly practical basis for the agreement over universal human rights and the way that this agreement is used to conceal substantive philosophies of human nature and the human good, implying, therefore, that theory is unavoidable and necessary and ought, at any rate, to be made explicit. But there is a tension nonetheless. In the hopes of appealing to something that precedes or transcends the vagaries of history and particularity, each of the authors, I think, has a tendency on occasion to juxtapose the methodological approach through elementary experience to theories of justice or of human nature. And each seems to suggest at times that a focus on elementary experience in its universality constitutes an alternative to such speculation or obviates the need for it. Now, there is an obvious sense, perhaps several obvious senses, in which this is unobjectionable. But without, I think, further clarification, it's potentially self-defeating, it seems to me, for it would rob elementary experience of what makes it compelling and relevant to these questions in the first place, namely the fact that it testifies to the truth of the human person. Now, let me reiterate that this is only a tension. The book contains any number of finely drawn points which counterbalance this concern. And yet, to the extent that this is a legitimate concern, I do see a couple of problems with it. First, I wonder whether it doesn't trade on something of an oversimplification of elementary experience in its relation to theory, and whether it can hold up to philosophical scrutiny. If experience is indeed responsive to a reality that precedes it, and that reality is indeed concrete and historical, and if that concrete historical reality is transmitted to us in language and culture, such that experience is not simply translated into judgments in a second moment, but already entails judgments, including the judgments of others, in its very intelligibility, then there can be no experience that is not already theoretical or already even philosophical or proto-philosophical in some sense. This seems to me to have some resonance with Father Giussani's positive sense of preconception. This is not to deny the universality of elementary experience or to adopt the historicist and multiculturalist stance criticized in the book. Rather, it's only to suggest that we'll have to reflect even more rigorously about the structure of experience and about the coincidence between universality and concrete particularity in experience. And I'd like to see this further developed. Now, admittedly, I am more of an admirer than a student of Father Giussani, but this more complex relation between theory and experience seems to hold for the concept of elementary experience itself. Clearly, it is not just the product of a pure pre-theoretical reflection upon the contents of one's experience. This would be a very abstract notion, ironically, but rather of a conscience deeply informed by the philosophical and theological patrimony of the Christian West. And perhaps I'm mistaken, but I've always thought that the concept of elementary experience not as an alternative to or a replacement for a philosophy of human nature, but as providing a dramatic first-person, inside view, a kind of evidence for what the tradition has always maintained as a matter of fundamental philosophical anthropologies, namely that we are creatures intrinsically ordered through our desire to the reality of goodness, beauty, and truth, which places upon us the burden of distinguishing real goodness and beauty and truth from what merely seems so. In other words, it places upon us the burden of philosophy, which stands to reason if indeed we are created for truth, and the need for it is a constitutive element of elementary experience itself. My second concern is that the conflicts which the book seeks to address, conflicts over the nature and source of law, conflicts over the universality, nature, and contents of rights, conflicts over competing conceptions of human dignity, really are conflicts over first principles. They raise unavoidable questions about the nature and meaning of justice, the nature and destiny of the human person, and what this reality that engages and claims experience is. The great difficulty of liberal societies, and a source of impasse far deeper, I think, than their superficial pluralism, is that they are premised on the idea that such questions are beyond the scope of reason, and therefore cannot really enter into public deliberation, and the fiction that the regime of law is neutral with respect to such ultimate questions. Yet I do not see how we can address these fundamental disagreements or even have a true dialogue without facing these conflicts squarely, nor how elementary experience could be of much help unless experience in its very content and structure testifies to the truth. And this is something we must inevitably speculate and theorize about. Now, I don't think I'm saying anything that Father Giussani doesn't say more profoundly and beautifully, or for that matter, anything that the authors of this book don't know themselves. And at various points, they make a great deal of precisely this point. And yet, nevertheless, they do sometimes convey the sense that elementary experience is a way of moving toward a more than merely practical consensus on questions of rights and dignity, without having to take up the fundamental disagreement over the nature and truth of things. And it's a little unclear to me how this would work. Marta Cartabia suggests, for instance, in the example of the so-called right to die, or the right to change sex, or the right to have a child by artificial means, that elementary experience helps to supply the criterion for distinguishing what is truly universal in our desires and needs from what is local and particular, the truly human from the impoverished image, and for limiting rights on that basis, which implies an ability to distinguish between what I truly and objectively want and from what I merely think I want. But she does not explain how any of this is to be done in these cases or what the conclusions would be. I don't disagree with the point, but I'd like to understand it better, nor how to prevent elementary experience itself from being treated in subjectivist or voluntarist fashion, from being, if you will, hijacked by particular interests, or as a mask to conceal a profoundly contested vision of human nature and destiny. The kind of anarchy, if you will, which Father Giussani calls a basic human temptation. Indeed, rights claims based on appeals to experience are a particular temptation when the rules of public reason virtually require us to deny any ultimate basis for those claims beyond an abstract and empty libertarian freedom. It seems to me then that the structure and content of elementary experience cannot simply be experienced, but rather that the truth of experience is something that always already has been and indeed ever needs to be theorized about and argued for, which means that the concept and method of elementary experience already presupposes and entails a very rich philosophy. So yes, I think we should plunge headlong into the concrete struggle for justice and the concrete reality where that struggle is most acute, to look for consensus and alliances where they can be found. Yes, I think we should plumb the depths of experience and attend with great rigor to its contents and structure, its needs and evidences, that we should ask the Augustinian question, what is it that I really love in loving this? And yes, I think by attending rigorously and closely to the experience of freedom and of unfreedom, we can gain a richer understanding of what freedom itself is, and whether the laws that express our desire for freedom and justice actually help us to realize them, or tragically hold us captive to a view of human being and destiny in which they are impossible to realize. But as a general corrective to the tension that I see here, or reminder if corrective is too strong, I would suggest that this approach will be most fruitful in helping us think about these important questions and in seeing what is really at stake in them, if it is offered not in juxtaposition to philosophies of human nature and justice, nor as a replacement for them, but rather if it realizes the richness of the philosophical project which it really has already undertaken, and if original experience itself is offered as evidence for the truth of the human being. For the universality disclosed in the needs and evidences of elementary experience is the universality surely of a creature. And if that is truly what we are, then surely that makes the ultimate difference to the true meaning and realization of our freedom. Thank you.
I said at the outset that if we had time, we would have 5 minutes of discussion with each of the panelists. I was looking forward to that because I wanted to demonstrate my own capacity to act as a devil's lawyer. But I can't play the devil's lawyer to a real lawyer, alas, or to a real theologian, alas, both of which are eminently equipped to respond to the devil or his lawyer. I want to thank our panelists for their contributions. I want to thank the authors of the volume that's been translated. And I want to thank them all for their efforts to return the law to its source and reason and justification, which is, I think, what they all wish to do. I leave you with this, that it seems to me that all of us who've been around for the last day or so and were privileged, I use that word advisedly, privileged to hear Dr. Bhatti speak yesterday, we saw there really a witness of what it means to engage the law while engaging one's humanity, and this in the most difficult of circumstances. And to see what's possible, what comes from that this isn't just a pipe dream, it isn't theorizing or noble ambition, but that justice matters to us all, and that those who love justice make a difference. Thank you.